After securing a temporary safe zone in the hospital, Ellie managed to reach drive. Colin's on her phone. His voice was shaky, laced with urgency. "Ellie, you need to listen to me. This isn't a natural virus." "What do you mean? I've seen this before," Colin said. "Back when I was working with the military on biological weapons. There was an experimental pathogen, one designed to incapacitate enemy forces. But it was deemed too dangerous, too unstable." Ellie's blood ran cold. "Are you saying this is your fault?" "I don't know," Collins admitted. "But if it's what I think it is, we're dealing with something far worse than a disease. You have to get out of Willow Creek. Head for the mountains. Stay away from densely populated areas." Before Ellie could press him further, the call cut off. Later that night, Ellie and Jake found an old TV in the hospital lounge. Miraculously, it still worked, though the static suggested most channels were offline. Jake fiddled with the controls until a news anchor's face appeared on the screen. Her makeup was smudged, and her eyes were wide with fear. "This is a global emergency," she said, her voice trembling. "The infection is spreading faster than anyone anticipated. Major cities are falling. New York, London, Tokyo, all overrun within hours. Governments are urging citizens to stay indoors and avoid contact with the infected. Martial law has been declared." The broadcast cut to shaky footage of swarms of infected overwhelming military checkpoints. Tanks fired into the crowds, but the infected kept coming, climbing over the bodies of their fallen. Ellie felt her chest tighten. "It's not just here," she whispered. "It's everywhere." Jake's expression hardened. "There's no cavalry coming. It's just us now." The screen flickered again, this time showing the President of the United States. His speech was somber. "We face an unprecedented threat. To those watching this, know that humanity will endure. We will find a way to fight back." The broadcast abruptly cut to static. Ellie turned to Jake. "What do we do now?" Jake tightened his grip on his weapon. "We survive." The automatic doors slid open with a faint hiss, and Ellie was immediately struck by the cacophony of sounds inside the hospital. Screaming, crying, the metallic crash of equipment hitting the floor. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The waiting area was a battlefield. People shoved past one another, desperate to get the attention of overwhelmed nurses. A woman clutched a toddler in her arms, her face streaked with tears. A man in a business suit staggered toward the reception desk, his arm bleeding profusely from what looked like a bite wound. "I need help," he shouted, slamming his fist on the counter. "Someone, please." Before he could finish, he collapsed to the floor, convulsing violently. The crowd stepped back, gasps of horror rippling through the room. Ellie froze, her breath caught in her throat. She watched as the man's body twisted unnaturally, his back arching as a guttural growl escaped his lips. His bloodshot eyes snapped open, unfocused yet predatory. He lunged at the nearest person, a young nurse, and sank his teeth into her shoulder. Her scream pierced the air as the crowd erupted into chaos. Ellie ducked behind a row of chairs, her heart pounding. The infected man tore into the nurse like a rabid animal, blood pooling beneath them. Within seconds, the nurse stopped struggling. Ellie thought it was over, until the nurse's body began to twitch. Her fingers curled into claws, her head jerking violently as she let out a low, guttural moan. "Oh my God," Ellie whispered. The nurse sprang to her feet, her eyes glazed and lifeless. She turned on the crowd, her movements jerky but fast. She leapt onto a man, knocking him to the ground and tearing into his throat. It was a chain reaction. The bitten rose minutes after they fell, their snarls mixing with the screams of the uninfected. Blood spattered the walls, and the pristine white floors of the hospital were soon slick with red. Ellie scrambled to her feet, pushing her way toward the hallway leading to the emergency rooms. The chaos in the waiting area was only the beginning. As Ellie stumbled down the hallway, she passed room after room of patients writhing on their beds. Doctors and nurses darted from one room to another, trying to administer aid, but it was clear they were losing control. In one room, a young girl clutched her mother's hand, her face pale and tear-streaked. The mother convulsed on the bed, her veins bulging against her skin, her eyes bloodshot. Ellie forced herself to look away as the woman's growls turned into guttural shrieks. Further down the hall, an orderly sprinted past her, dragging a supply cart. "Get out while you still can," he yelled over his shoulder. Ellie didn't need to be told twice. She turned a corner and collided with someone, nearly falling to the floor. "Watch it," the man snapped, steadying her. Ellie looked up and saw a man in tactical gear. His eyes were sharp, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Are you bit?" he demanded. "No," Ellie stammered, shaking her head. The man, Jake, grunted and shoved a crowbar into her hands. "Good. Stick close if you want to live." Jake led Ellie further into the hospital, moving with precision and purpose. They passed through the maternity ward, where a group of nurses were frantically barricading the doors. "You can't save everyone," Jake muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Don't you even care?" Ellie shot back. Jake stopped, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Caring doesn't keep you alive. Keep moving." They reached the surgical wing, where Jake shoved open a supply closet and motioned for Ellie to enter. "We'll rest here. It's safer than out there." Ellie hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched the crowbar. She could still hear the screams echoing through the hospital. "How can this be happening?" she whispered, sinking to the floor. Jake sat against the wall, his expression grim. "This isn't an accident. Someone made this." Ellie's stomach churned. She thought of Dr. Collins and his cryptic warnings. Could he have known this was coming? Their respite didn't last long. The snarls of the infected grew louder, followed by the sound of shattering glass. "They're breaking through," Jake said, pulling Ellie to her feet. They bolted from the closet, weaving through the labyrinth of hallways. Ellie's legs burned, but adrenaline kept her moving. Ahead, the fire exit loomed. Jake kicked the door open, and they spilled out into the night. Ellie turned back, her breath hitching as she saw the hospital engulfed in chaos. The infected poured out through broken windows and doors, their growls echoing into the night. "We have to keep moving," Jake said, his tone urgent. Ellie nodded, forcing herself to look away. She didn't know where they were going or how they would survive, but one thing was certain: Willow Creek was no longer safe. The road stretched endlessly ahead, littered with abandoned cars, broken glass, and bodies. Ellie gripped the strap of her backpack tightly, her eyes darting to every shadow. Jake walked a few paces ahead, his crowbar swinging casually at his side, though Ellie could tell he was on high alert. "How far is this base?" Ellie asked, her voice low. "About 10 miles, Jake replied. "If the rumors are true, it's our best shot." Ellie wasn't sure she believed in safe zones. Everywhere they'd been so far was either abandoned or overrun. But what choice did they have? The distant sound of snarling snapped her out of her thoughts. Jake held up a hand, signaling her to stop. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Ahead, a group of infected was clustered around a mangled corpse in the middle of the road. Their rotting hands tore at flesh, their growls wet and guttural. Ellie's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay silent. "Follow me," Jake murmured, leading her off the road and into the dense trees lining the highway. They crept through the underbrush, the infected snarls fading as they moved farther away. Ellie's heartbeat slowed slightly, though the tension never left her body. They stumbled upon the farmhouse at dusk. It was a modest, weathered building surrounded by a collapsing wooden fence. The front door was ajar, swinging lightly in the breeze. Jake motioned for Ellie to stay back as he approached the house. "Stay here, I'll check it out." Ellie hesitated but nodded, gripping her wrench tightly. Jake disappeared into the house, the silence stretching unbearably. Ellie shifted nervously, her eyes scanning the darkening fields. A sudden scream shattered the quiet. Ellie bolted toward the house, her heart pounding. Inside, she found Jake wrestling with an infected man in tattered clothes. The creature snapped its jaws at him, its fingers clawing at his vest. "Ellie," Jake barked. Without thinking, Ellie swung her wrench, connecting with the infected skull. It collapsed to the floor, twitching once before going still. "Nice swing," Jake muttered, wiping blood off his cheek. A soft sobbing sound drew their attention. In the corner of the room, a teenage girl huddled behind an overturned table, her hands covering her face. Jake approached cautiously. "Hey, kid, it's okay. We're not going to hurt you." The girl looked up, her tear-streaked face pale. They're all gone. My mom, my dad." They turned. Ellie crouched beside her. "What's your name?" "Mila," the girl whispered. "We're heading to a safe zone," Ellie said gently. "You can come with us." Mila hesitated, then nodded. They found Marcus in a convenience store a few miles down the road. He was a wiry man in his late 40s, his glasses cracked and his lab coat stained with blood.